4. Coldly, the Rowbottoms rubbed knees under the oak table. Mrs. Spark was near to breaking point. Mr. Rowbottom pulled open his mouth with a smacking noise. "What is really the purpose then, Mrs. Spark? I mean, bringing us here like this after the funeral? What do you want from us?" Deliberately, Mrs. Spark replied, "I would prefer you not, Mr. Rowbottom. I would prefer you not to speak of my daughter at this time." A tear edged its way to the side of her nose. Impatiently, she dabbed it. Mr. Rowbottom continued. "You got us here for a kind of purpose. I know you, Mrs. Spark, and I wasn't born yesterday. What is it? Is it anything to do with our other celebrations, if you follow me? Which you do, don't you? Is it?" Lawrence Creedy's eyebrow formed a question. He also wanted to know. At this point there was an abrupt knock on the door. All heads swiveled to the door. Squire Fenn entered. Excluding Lawrence Creedy, everyone in the room lowered their heads as the squire moved round the table to take his place at the top. The meeting was open. Rowbottom continued as soon as the squire had seated himself. "Well, now the squire himself is here," he nodded deferentially to the squire and forged on. "Well, perhaps you'll tell us the purpose. I mean, it can't be just to read poetry and that. I know you too well, and if it is only reading poetry and that, we're going. Aren't we, mates?" The labourers smiled and said nothing. Rowbottom was about to chunter on when the squire silenced him. "Rowbottom, you say too much. Don't. Spoils your image. We need silence. I'm right, Mrs. Spark, aren't I, eh?" Mrs. Spark nodded. "Squire, would you read us an old village legend I came across the other day?" She slid the battered volume across the table to the squire. It hissed along the polished surface before entering his cracked hands. The squire had a small, intelligent head, and a feast of white hair, parted down the centre, perfectly cutting his head in half. He was very proud of his hair. He let it curl onto his jacket collar. "The third legend in the book, please, squire." The precision of Mrs. Spark's speech was, to say the least, unnerving. She carved her words with a ruthless chisel before allowing them to represent her in the doubtful business of communication. The squire opened the book on the legend in question. He began to read. "When it was the midsummer, celebrations under the sun. Morning was heavy with lusting, and the young maiden trailed her pale hair in oak leaves. Her laughing was longer than summer. Then brown hands muscled their way, and took her and danced her again and again. Brown eyes lusting for pale hair." As he read this, even the hungry eyes of Rowbottom glazed. The squire was surprised. Mrs. Spark did not blink, but listened to the floating of silence. Slowly, her head began to sway backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. Her harmony enveloped the watchers, her music possessed them. Water laved over them. The room became spray. Their heads rocked like tongueless bells on the steeples of their shoulders. Mrs. Spark whispered, "Brown eyes lusting for pale hair. So they took her and danced her, then took her among them and delved in her deeply. Breasts and her navel shone in the summer as they took her and danced midsummer dances. Maidenhead gone where the poppy breaks corn, and she bled on the poppies under the oak tree when the dancing was over, on her breasts and her navel, now red in the summer, and they climbed with her, swaying in the leaves of the oak tree, and blessed fever of summer, and coiled her pale hair around her snow shoulders, and snapped the pale bones in her white, foaming neck, and through her dead, dancing, high through the warm branches, low to the shadows, and death, her new dancer, and then her ripe blood bubbled her mouth, and swam down her breasts and her navel, and all her bright laughter was loosed to the wind, where the butterflies dance the dance of midsummer. Mrs. Sparks' voice purred on one note. The swaying of the listeners had subsided, only she moved in time to her thoughts. In the strained faces around her, there was the knowledge that the legend was aimed at them. The legend was of them. Perhaps it was them. Perhaps it was the undercurrent of the summer ritual. Yes, they were excited by the story, and they were appalled by the excitement the story released in them. Creedy looked along the length of the table to discover each held the other's hand. The squire's mapped fingers were clutching his, and he was clutching James. Unconsciously they had formed the circle. The only noise in the white room was the murmurings of Mrs. Spark. She was repeating over and over sounds which had no meaning. Her eyes were withdrawn in herself. The sun continued to pour through the open windows, and then, when there was only sunshine to cling to, a breeze rustled over the window ledge. It paused to catch its breath, and then whispered in a circle round the table. And clinging to it, a flame butterfly twittered into the room. 14 eyes clung to the butterfly. Mrs. Spark was still withdrawn in herself. Unperturbed by its audience, it hovered near a bundle of manuscripts. The breeze hissed the butterfly until it was suspended some 12 inches above Mrs. Spark's nose. Mrs. Spark whispered to someone not in the room.
Where are you? In your new dimension, is there rest? Listen to me, Diane. I know my words are meaningless on the other planes, but I still feel you clinging to the bark of our trees. I still feel you wound in the earth. Try and answer me. Some sign. Any sign. I know words to the dead are only scratches on the pane of glass. You hear the squeak as the glass is marked, but come the mist, the glass is unmarked again and only reflects the light. Diane, I am trying to force my words into a groove that will reach you. Though I feel only my friends and the walls hear them. Only the walls.
The butterfly fluttered onto her left breast. It sensed the pulse of her tired nipple. The pulse was too slow for living. She had consciously trapped herself between the living and the dead. The strain on her middle-aged heart was acute. For the first time she noticed the butterfly. Her words became softer and clearer. Slightly cricking her neck, she turned to the butterfly.
Diane, are you turned to a pair of wings? How did you die, little girl? Were you murdered? Or was it just the snap of a branch? Listen to me. Help me. If you were only broken by a tree fall, I will be able to sleep again, but if you were killed by men, I will open the pit. To help you sleep, I will.
Creedy, who had enjoyed the experiment until now, felt the sweat on the palms of his hands cool to an ice slush. The labourers allowed themselves to slide into her imagination. The Rowbottoms were very excited.
Tian, were you murdered? Tell me, I promise you retribution. Blood, I promise you.
David did not move. Nothing. He listened. Nothing. The eyes still burned on his neck. "Come out. It's gone past the game. Come out." The eyes refused to answer. David started to run again. A snail scrunched under his feet, then, without warning, an arrow bit into an elm tree on his right. Arrows were all right for children, but in the middle of a grown-up wood? This was ridiculous. And slightly critical. David slowed his run down to a stop. All right. The game's a game, but there's no need to turn it into bloody Robin Hood. Come out and we'll chat it over." Silence. Even the wood pigeons gave up their shooting. Only a fern uncoiled in a shaft of sunlight. Another arrow flashed in front of him. David pulled it out of the turf. He wondered whether a few words to the archer would solve the dilemma. He decided against it and walked away. A wood pigeon clattered a few inches above his head. David persuaded his feet to run and dash towards the thicket. The pigeon's shooing harshed to a tight shriek, and it clattered out of the leaves, an arrow in its stubby neck. Besides being a humorist, the archer was becoming serious. David bent down to examine the dead pigeon. A treacle smear of blood made the bird's beak sticky. Nice in one of Mum's pies, he thought, as he held it by the old man's claw. The hooked prongs of the bird's feet were covered in slimy leather. Just a touch, it made David feel sick. Even though it was dead, it quivered twice in his hands. Suddenly he found himself in the vice of a half Nelson. All David could see was a brown wrist lugging his neck back. His training had taught him to completely relax, just this side of going limp, so he completely relaxed, just this side of going limp. His head hung loose like a pendulum. The half Nelson became less vicious. Hanlin counted a silent 1, 2, 3 and lashed behind him with his left foot. The steel tip on his heel ripped into the attacker's ankle. In the flush of pain, he loosened his grip a second on David's neck. Immediately, David slammed his whole body against his attacker. They both scrunched onto the ground. David managed to slip free from the vice as he fell. He badly bruised his shoulder. Almost at once, they were on their feet, circling one another. David partially tripped on the dead pigeon. A blackberry thorn ripped its claw into his left hand. His hand pulsed violently. 4 feet away from him, a young man flexed on his toes. He was barely 22 and of Romany extraction. That's if appearances meant anything. Appearances often don't. Sun had burst the man's skin to a bronze. He was dressed in a battered pair of blue jeans, and that's all. Neither shirt nor sandals civilized him. Copper rings clung to his earlobe, and his hair was a circus of black snakes. It ripped down his chin into a beard. A grin split his face like a melon. He edged towards his bow, which swung from the lower branch of a silver birch. As he backed to the tree, light licked his face. His features were definitely a mixture of pale Negroid and Arab. Fast and dark, his hand uncoiled to the bow. David swerved to his right. The Negroid eyes followed David's movement. David doubled back fractionally in his tracks, and then with 2 giant leaps, he rugger-tackled. He was only able to clamp a partial grip on him, but sufficient to trip him up. David was extremely strong, but he found he could not pin him down. He even attempted a karate chop on the exposed neck. The gypsy avoided the blow and lashed out with his knee, bruising David's ribcage. David recovered and hurled himself at his attacker. He caught David's parallel body with both feet in the gut. David was catapulted over his head. Hanlin's wallet left his inside pocket as he was rammed by his own velocity into a handful of fern. Holding his gut, painfully he achieved his feet. Breathing was like emery paper rubbed on the back of his hand until blood comes. Brushing the headache out of his eyes, he refocused on the gypsy, who appeared to be very amused. His melon grin had spread to 2 melons. He held his bow in his left hand, and an arrow between his teeth. He's seen too many Indian films, thought David. In his right hand he held David's wallet. He spoke with the arrow between his teeth. His words were badly formed, but still recognizably English. Your wallet, mister. Rough on you, eh? You ain't got no wallet no more. You got nothing but a bunch of bruises. And they're free. David noticed that he wore the beard to cover up tiny white spots which punctuated his chin. The moustache under his squash nose was only a boyish wisp. It wouldn't grow properly, and he was very concerned about it. Laddie, I should return my wallet, or your moustache might wither and drop off. The strain of stealing is very severe on beards. The gypsy's reply was to thumb open the wallet. I shouldn't do that, laddie. The contents might give you hair failure. I said I shouldn't. I said... The gypsy examined the contents. He did not have to look far. In the usual place for photographs, he read the following. Detective Inspector David Hanlin, Scotland Yard, Special Branch. He dropped the wallet as though it had nibbled him. He rubbed his moustache. One of the white spots oozed by his nose. You see what I mean, laddie? Hey, you ain't what it says in there, are you? Hanlin examined his numerous bruises. Yes, I'm afraid so. My wallet, please. Thank you. What's your name? Where do you live? What are you doing arrowing passers-by? Have you a license for that weapon? Come on, show me. And no lies. My bruises have narrowed my sense of humour. Sorry, mister, I ain't got no license, and they call me Jippo. I live in these woods, and I'm sorry. You haven't got a proper name. Never mind a license. What do you know about the death of a certain little girl? As he said this, he picked up his briefcase and moved on. Jippo followed him, sliding the arrow from his mouth to the quiver on his nude shoulders. Which girl, mister? I mean, Mr. Policeman? David grabbed the lad by his hair and shook him like a messy cat. Oh, come on, you know all right, son. You know what I mean. And whatever you've heard about police toleration, especially when they come to deal with lying and evasion, well, you can take it from me. There's no such bloody thing. I could throw the book at you. You'd probably get 6 months for trying to William Tell a policeman for a start. And 3 months extra for a disagreeable face. And I do find your face disagreeable. So, you can oblige yourself and tell me by answering the trifles I ask you, right? Now, how did Diane Spark die? She was murdered, wasn't she? Ritual murder. Jippo was silent. David ripped a small tuft of hair from the back of the boy's head. In spite of himself, Jippo squealed. Gah! Come on! Come on! All right, show you, mister. I'll take you where it happened. Oh, it was an accident. David released the boy. Jippo's eyes tightened to a pinpoint of hate. Jippo was an expert with hate. He hated most things. A long time ago he decided he was an outcast, and whether society regarded him as undesirable or not, he was putting in a lot of hate hours to ensure he would be finally ostracized. Fortunately for him, David didn't see the hate. If he had, he would probably have reacted violently. Well, his identity was out. Everyone in the village would know within a few hours, and his investigations had hardly begun. Come on, laugh, Hanlin, laugh. It may be the last opportunity you have for a long while. No, laddie, I don't think it was an accident. I'm part of a research team from Scotland Yard. Actually, I'm in charge. So, take me to where it happened, and I advise you to tell me everything you know. Jippo grinned. His breath smelt of uncooked mushrooms. I also advise you, laddie, to forget my identity, and then, with a bit of luck, I may forget you. Accompanied by his grin, Jippo reiterated his lack of knowledge concerning Diane as he led the inspector through the wood. Eventually they came out of the trees and David saw the Cornwall hills. Cobalt blue in the mid-distance, the giant oak tree lent her ripe branches to the tug of the sea. Free salt air swirled in the leaves like evening rain. The leaves chattered to one another as the humans blundered on to the landscape. Without warning, Jippo ran towards the oak tree, but David was quicker. He tripped the lad into the spiky grass and swiftly moved to the base of the tree. About 4 feet from the roots, a monkey's head was hat-pinned to the bark, and flanked by 2 bats. A sprig of garlic crowned this 3-dimensional mural. Someone was obviously trying to impress someone with the basics of Gothicism. But who was trying to impress who? He turned to question Jippo. Amicably grinning, Jippo stood up. Well, as amicably as a professional hater can grin. Sonny, why did you run towards this oak? You wanted to destroy these signs, didn't you? I'll hunt this village out, and if I find any dabbling in the occult here, I'll split this village down its seams. Now, who did this? Who? Me, of course, policeman. I did. See? I'm interested in pretty things. Bats' wings are pretty, ain't they? As you're a nice man and so full of brains, it amazes me how you didn't know.